y'all, Miss Edwards here. I'm here to talk about shading your 1 or 2 point perspective drawing. So what we're going to be talking about today is pencil shading. Kitty, be quiet. And the first thing you need to do whenever you are creating your shading plan is to think of a light source. So remember when we did the boxes, we had to pick a light source and make sure that we followed that light source whenever we were coloring or shading. It's the same concept with buildings, except you have an actual landscape to deal with. Same with if you're doing a hallway in the inside, your light source will probably be coming from the light in your drawing. Mine, because I don't have a sun drawn on mine, I put a little sticky note to remind me where my light source is going to be. And when you're shading, it is best to use a variety of pencils. So I have an eraser in case I mess up, but also this is really useful for lightening any shadows you make. For instance, if you want to highlight in something. I have a dark ebony pencil, which you don't need to have, but it's really helpful to have. It's just a really dark 6B pencil. I have a 2H pencil, which isn't the lightest pencil you can get, but it is really useful for making those really light shades of gray that if you don't want to make it super dark. I have a regular 2B pencil. That's what the number 2 on the 2 pencils stands for, 2B. Just so I have that with me. And then I have the sketching pencil, which is pretty much just a 6B pencil. I'm fancy, so I have this eraser that Mr. Gibbons gave to me that I can use for any small spaces, but if you're not fancy, that's okay. This regular eraser will be just fine. You can just use the corner of it to make your tiny eraser marks. I also have this blending tool. You can use a rolled up tissue, a rolled up paper towel, or a paintbrush. If you don't have one of these, this is just a rolled up piece of paper. It just helps me kind of smooth out my blending quickly without using my finger, because my finger is really oily and I don't want my paper to end up an oily mess. You can see I've already kind of used it down here. But let's get started. So my light source is coming from this direction. It's kind of over everything, so it's daytime, but I still am going to have some shadows. I'm going to have some shadows coming off my buildings over here a little bit. And so what I'm going to do first is actually lay out those shadows so that I can start my shading. So I'm going to draw in the basic shape of what my shadows are going to look like. And you need to make sure that you are following the 1 point perspective that you have started for yourself. Don't get it off, because if it's off, your whole drawing is going to look off. So I'm just following my perspective lines the best I can. You can even use a ruler to help you with that. And then I'm going to just lightly shade everything in. You can probably barely see it, but because everything is going to be covered in the shadow, I'm going to shade everything. If you can hear my cat, he is crying outside my door right now. But the thing I want you to pay attention to on the shading of your buildings or your hallway is that not everything is going to be the same shade of gray. So as you can see in this shadow alone, I have a couple objects. I have a cat, I have a bird, I have a dog that got free, and I have a sidewalk, and I have a street. So I have all these things within my one shadow that I need to shade individually. So the way I'm going to do that is I've shaded lightly, and I was holding the pencil from the back so I didn't press hard, using my lighter pencil. Let's just clean that up a little bit. And now, because this road is going to be darker than the actual objects on my paper, I'm going to actually shade the part of the shadow that's darker on the road. Because the road is a dark color. When you think about the color of things and the shading process, we have to think about what color would it be in real life. And if it's not white, it needs to be a shade of gray. I am gonna leave this line dividing the road lighter because it is a lighter color. It would be yellow if I were to make it a color. So I don't want to shade it too dark. And again, I'm holding the pencil from the back and holding it kind of sideways so that I don't have a lot of pencil lines all over my paper, because the more pencil lines you have, the harder they are to get rid of. My cat is going crazy. So now I've shaded this part of the road a little bit darker. Because I want to continue on with that, I'm going to take my blending tool and I'm going to go in circles, trying to make sure all those shadows get blended. And notice that I'm not going over everything, I'm only going over the road because that's what I want to see what it looks like when it is shaded. You'll notice that when you do use a blending tool, such as this rolled up piece of paper, a Torchillion, a paper towel, or a paintbrush, the colors get lighter. So you want to make sure that you go back over it if you need to. So I have this bird that I'm going around these lines here, and I'm going around the dog because my dog is going to be lighter than the road. It's still in a shadow, but it's still lighter than the road. If it was a black dog, it would be darker. Sorry about my cat. So now I've done just a basic shadow on the road. You can see the sidewalk is different than the road. It's slightly less gray. So say I want my cat to be a black cat. Obviously I would make it darker. So I'm gonna take this dark ebony pencil and I'm just gonna very carefully color the cat in. Lionel is singing you the song of his people. I hope you enjoy it. So now I have that part laid out. I do need to shade this part, which I'm not going to do in this video, but I also wanted to talk about the smaller objects in the video. So for instance, this drawing is got trash bags in it. I'm going to make those trash bags dark because they would be dark if they were in color, unless they were white trash bags, but in this case they are black trash bags. So I'm using my ebony pencil to make those dark values. Notice that I am not shading over the entire project all at once. I'm doing it in individual steps. That is what you want to do because you want yours to have all those details not get lost within your drawing. So if I look at this, I see that there's not a lot of shadow or not a lot of highlights in there. I can take my eraser, erase out some highlights just so they don't get lost. Then thinking about some other stuff in the back, like my ground, if it's not white, it's gonna be a shade of gray. So I'm gonna have to make it that shade of gray. So I'm going to take my pencil and I'm just gonna start coloring lightly. And I think my light's gonna get brighter as it gets closer to the end of my paper. So I'm just gonna be really careful about where I go on my drawing. If I mess up, take my eraser, just erase that out, and continue. You can also use your blending tool if it's got a little bit of dark on it. You can use that to help blend out your shadows. Make them nice and neat. Remember, if you're blending something, you don't want to blend over everything. You only want to blend in the parts that you've been working on, because otherwise it's going to turn out looking really messy. So taking your time is kind of key on this. if we think about the shadows that are going to be on this cat from the sun over here, we will notice that it's going to be casting a shadow to the left. So I'm going to draw a basic shape for that shadow and color it in. I'm going around the tiny cactus that you can barely see because that's going to be a different shade of gray. And if I want it to be really dark, I can take my ebony pencil and add that dark shadow. So if I want to smooth it out, take my little blending tool and just carefully go over everything, making sure that I am not making it messy. If I want to bring this shadow out a little bit, I can use my blending tool to do that as well. And of course, there's going to be a shadow coming off of these buildings as well. So we need to make sure that we have our shadows on the road. And these buildings are different heights, so the shadows will also be different heights. For instance, this one is shorter, so the shadow is going to be shorter. And I can go back in and redefine the sidewalk lines. Because those would not disappear. But you can see that it looks like a shadow. You also want to pay attention to if something is dark on the inside. So for instance, the inside of this building is going to be really dark. Not everywhere, but on the most inner part of it. So I'm going to shade it to be dark. Just so you know that it's not a flat space, it's actually a hole. And I might have each brick or pillar or whatever you want to call it have a little bit of shadow on it. And I'll take my darker gray and add a tiny bit of dark gray to show that it's getting darker inside. So it's really detail oriented, thinking about what you're going to shade and what you're going to leave. Just know that when you're shading, if it is not white in your head, then it should not be white on your paper. The only thing that's going to be purely white on my paper are maybe the flames, if I were to shade them, which this side's going to be in color, but on this side, the clouds would have white on them. Maybe this danger sign has white on them, and maybe these little Z's are white, but everything else is going to be a shade of gray. So I don't want to leave anything super white unless I'm pretending it's like a white brick. So again, I can take my little blending tool, go in circles. I'm sure some of you find this sound to be the worst sound in the world. But you can see how I am slowly creating those values. I'm not rushing through it. I'm not trying to get it done as fast as possible. I'm just trying to take my time, make sure I pay attention to my light source, and make sure that I am trying to get the most accurate values that are in my head on this paper. So that's just the inside of that building. The outside might be a different shade of gray. And remember that your buildings are going to cast shadows depending on where your light source is, so you really want to pay attention to where that light source is. Obviously this is not finished, but it is started. So I'm expecting y'all to use these skills, try and get yours to be just as detailed. The more time you spend on it, the more special it's going to look in the end, and the more individual it will look. You can always add fun details like different patterns with your shading. I know that sometimes I like to get a little crazy and go a lot darker than it should be, but you're just going to take your time. Make sure that you are paying attention to those details and keeping that light source in mind. So again, my sun is over here. That means my shadows are on the opposite side. And that's all I got for you on the shading.